So hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today to discuss what really feels like a culture of misinformation and disinformation. I'm Callie Long. I'm the Associate Secretary for Communications for the PCC. And with me today are Catherine Sisk from our Justice Department and Kara Ehrhardt, our Sexuality and Inclusion Program Coordinator. And for tech questions, Grace McCreary is on hand, and Heather Chappell, who is also from the Communications Department, has also joined us today. I'd like to mention at this point that Alison Carr, our Associate Secretary for Justice Ministries, could not be with us today and sends regrets and regards to all of you. Most importantly, our guest speaker today is Sara Speicher. Sara is the Deputy General Secretary for the World Association for Christian Communication, and Sara is an expert on misinformation, disinformation, and AI, specifically in the context of their impact on faith communities and how we, as faith communities and as Christians, can and should respond to what feels like a flood of false information and fake news. Welcome, Sara. Thank you for joining us today. So before we start, a few housekeeping matters. We are recording the presentation part of the webinar, and we'll be sharing that with all of you later. Your cameras are switched off for the most part, although I do see some cameras are on, that's fine. Your mics, however, are muted to facilitate the webinar. You feel free at any time to use the chat function. Kara is monitoring the chat and is going to feed into the discussion at appropriate times, any questions or comments that you may put in the chat. And we do have a Q&A session planned at the end of Sara's presentation, so there'll be lots of time to ask questions and have Sara answer them. And finally, before we start, Catherine is going to open our webinar today with a land acknowledgement and prayer before handing over to Sara. Thank you, Catherine, and again, welcome everyone. Catherine, you muted.
Thank you. Sorry, I couldn't unmute. Thank you for joining us today. I'm speaking from Toronto, which is the traditional territory of the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe peoples, and part of Treaty 13, which is held by the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation. We acknowledge that people in this online space are on the traditional territories of many different Indigenous peoples, largely, though not exclusively, across the land now called Canada. We acknowledge the sacred connection between Indigenous people and the lands that they have held and cared for from time immemorial, and the ongoing care that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis have shown and continue to show for the land. Last year, the Presbyterian Church in Canada apologized for its complicity in colonization and the residential school system. In our apology, we make several commitments, including the commitments to continue listening to Indigenous people, leaders, elders, and knowledge keepers, and to tell the truth about the past. It has been said that there can be no reconciliation without truth. In recent years, we have seen an increase in narratives that deny the negative impacts of residential schools. These false narratives have been promoted in an effort to avoid Canada's responsibility for upholding Indigenous rights and well-being. Learning to identify and challenge these false narratives is one way we can honor our commitments to listening and to telling the truth. As members of a church that ran residential schools, we are called to participate in the work of reconciliation. Sara Speicher's presentation today will give us tools to be better informed about how we can identify false narratives and uphold the truth. And now let us open our time in prayer. Living God, we thank you for this day, for all that sustains us, and for this time together. Guide us in our time today and every day. And may your Spirit lead our minds, hearts, and actions to follow the example of love for you and for our neighbors, as Jesus taught us. Amen. On to you, Sara.
Thank you so much, Catherine and Callie and Kara and all those who are making this, addressing this critical topic so important. So I'm going to start with a disclaimer. I am a dual US UK citizen and I live in the UK. So I'm not extremely familiar with the Canadian media landscape itself, but I hope that what I share resonates with the context that you find yourself in. And I look forward to the discussion where we can perhaps look in more detail, specifically in the Canadian context. I'm also coming from the perspective of whack, if my system will work. Okay. This worked before. Let me stop the sharing and I'm going to start again. Now it works. Right. So I'm coming from the perspective of the World Association for Christian Communication, which is an organization that was founded in 1968 by Christian broadcasters concerned about the ethics of mass media. At that time, of course, that was television, that was radio, it was newspapers. And they were concerned about the concentration of power, the influence media had over the population, the information access, affordability, all of these types of issues. And as communication technologies have evolved, the fundamental ethical and rights principles have remained. So misinformation, disinformation are major challenges in our societies, and they happen in a complex information ecosystem, which is why tackling them is not as easy as just saying, that's wrong, here's the facts. So before we get into the presentation, I have two questions for you. So the first is something that I would like you to put into the chat that Kara is monitoring, and he's got the chat Q&A. So I would like you to think a bit and put into the chat your definition of news. How would you define news? So take a little moment to think about that and start putting in your definition there. And then I'm going to ask you to multitask, and a poll is going to come up, I hope, on how do you get most of your news? So the question would be, you have to choose one of the poll in the poll. So you have A through G, basically, operating. So think about that. How do you get most of your news? So this is really interesting because so far, most people are getting their news on television. That's really interesting. Okay, news websites and apps, free ones. So that's really interesting because it's showing the predominance of television and the free news websites and apps, and then one person who pays or subscribes to a news agency and visits their site or their app. So Kara, I'm just going to, can you share some of the definitions of news
Yeah.
that you got in the chat?
We've got a few here. We have someone saying that they define news as reports about things that are happening now or happened recently. Another says information about emerging events, situations, and contexts. Another person says factual reporting of events. And the last one I've got here also says factual reporting in journalism, not opinion.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's just helpful for us to kind of think about what is information, what is news, because we're going to be using both of these kind of specifically. And news can generally be seen as information about current events. It can cover a spectrum of types of news, whereas information is broader on a particular subject. But the misinformation, disinformation happens for all of those. Now, so what we're covering today is laying out the context for our news and information landscape, and then giving some ideas on how to address it with, I hope, some time and questions for a good discussion at the end. So first, misinformation. So the difference between misinformation and disinformation is largely about intention. So misinformation is incomplete, inaccurate, misleading information or content, which is shared by people who don't realize that it is false or misleading. So one could call it a mistake. So there's a couple of screenshots then from the BBC of examples of misinformation. So one is a meme claiming potholes under the King's coach were hastily filled in with sand for the coronation. But the truth is the council did that to keep the horses pulling the coach safe from drain holes. So it wasn't potholes, it was drain holes. Another are tweets saying that an earthquake happened in Dubai, but what residents actually heard were in fact demolition works. And we could think about this type of misinformation as not a very serious concern. So these examples on their own wouldn't seem to have a major disruptive impact. But raising an issue about councils not filling potholes can feed into general complaints and attitudes about local authority. Or if rumors about an earthquake spread, would emergency services be called and distracted from real emergencies? Authorities might have to spend more money and energy correcting information. And the other bit that concerns is that people aren't really checking, perhaps, to see if something is true or not. And that can lead to further problems. Now, disinformation is deliberate. It is false or inaccurate information that is intentionally created and spread to mislead and manipulate people. It is intended to sow mistrust. It may not be intended so that people really believe it, but it's to make people less trustful of certain sources and therefore more susceptible to being steered in a certain way or ignore that source of information in the future. So, for example, and I will mention Trump a lot because he's just such a good example of disinformation. During the response to Hurricane Helene in the US, Trump claimed that the federal government was only giving victims $750 and comparing that to the millions spent on illegally supporting illegal migrants. There's another example would be from last year's US presidential election. There was a video featuring a Haitian man, who was really not Haitian, saying he had just gotten to the United States and had voted in 2 counties in Georgia. But it turned out to be a fake video from Russia. So often, in this case, disinformation takes a grain of truth and then it twists it. And this is also called malinformation. So the explanations then can be more complicated than the original claim, and people don't take the time to think through it or check some of the basic facts. So when Trump mentioned the $750, that was indeed the upfront immediate payment the Federal Emergency Management Agency would give to affected people, but more assistance would be available. But the short claim makes a good headline. And if you say, yes, but, that's harder to get across, as well as being later in the news cycle. And there are also other terms that people use. And propaganda is certainly disinformation, but it's typically more organized and systemic, and it's designed to influence public opinion in a certain way. So most commonly used by governments or particular organizations. Generally now, when someone says something is fake news, I interpret that it's probably a pretty accurate article, but they just don't like it. And of course, generative AI is making disinformation and deepfakes, which are images and sound that are manipulated to a quality that is harder to spot as fakes. It makes all these much easier to create, so much more of them. Rage bait is sharing something you know is false only to generate outrage and to take up media space, and maybe make money. Again, Trump is very good at that. And part of the essential challenge we face is that it's a lot easier to make people believe something is fake than to convince them that it's not. What also complicates efforts is the distorted battle between free speech and that any limits on one's right to say anything, including speech that we would deem violent and harmful, is in effect a gag order, as this one person describes at length in a Canadian opinion piece I picked up yesterday. And the right to freedom of expression is enshrined in both the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Canadian Charter. And the right to freedom of expression is to ensure all people are able to express dissent and opinions against powerful interests without retribution. But I think we need to keep in mind that rights are not limitless. Rights come with responsibilities. And one group cannot be privileged to have greater rights than another, or to claim rights that deny others their right. So freedom of expression does not automatically entitle people to spread false information and hate that creates harm or pushes others off platforms so they don't have a voice. And the fact that people can declare, like this person did, that that they're questioning and they don't have free speech is actually an indication that free speech is pretty healthy. And I think those, especially in the faith community, have a special call, though, to promote a dialogue with respect. Now, the challenges we face have been around for centuries, but the scale and speed and the impact of distorted information is massively higher. And to recognize and deal with misinformation and disinformation, we have to have some broader understanding of how our media, and specifically the news landscape, has changed over the last several decades. So I'm going to start with my hometown newspaper, the Youngstown Vindicator. This is the newspaper I grew up with. The Vindicator was an independent, local family-run newspaper, which upheld much of what we rely on for our news. Lots of local information and local commentary on national news, as well as strong investigative reporting that kept local authorities accountable and transparent, including some notable investigations against the Mafia and the Ku Klux Klan. We had a very exciting city. Like most newspapers, it was published once a day. Local journalists researched and wrote the news. There were fact-checked. There was editorial oversight. The family closed the paper in 2019 after 150 years. There were some poor business decisions, but the major factors were that its main sources of income dried up. People no longer subscribed to the print edition or the digital edition because they could get other online news for free, and advertising income dried up as advertisers went to other digital platforms with higher views. So it's just one newspaper from a town that only locals visit. So why did this get covered by The Guardian in the United Kingdom? Because it was one more in a major trend of individually owned papers closing and also then being bought up by a larger media company. So the Youngstown Vindicator still exists, but the current owner is a regional media publisher with a number of other media brands. It takes less from original reporting, more news from pooled stories, and it has a definite different editorial slant. So the trend is that news agency ownership is increasingly concentrated. And simply stated, ownership can determine how the news is reported, both in quality and bias. So this is not necessarily independent media. In quality, public interest news is expensive. You need qualified journalists, and their expenses to travel and to research. You need quality researchers and editors and time to verify and format. And now there's even more pressure on content because there's a 24-hour news cycle. And all of this happens when 50% of news advertising revenue globally has gone to Facebook and Google. And many people don't feel that they need to pay for subscriptions because you can find your news online for free. And here, Canada's law trying to address some of this imbalance in funding is what I would consider very positive and would actually like to see more of. Now, accompanying these two trends is the growth of small, even individually run media sites that can look professional but have vastly varying interests and quality. And of course, you have the social media algorithms, which keep sending you more of what you look at, so you can start to see your news in a silo and believe that that's the whole reality. So the change in our digital consumption of news and the push to make things more entertaining or shocking to get more views has blurred the line for many people that all news sources are not equal. I think everyone recognizes that there is political bias, from extreme left to extreme right and everything in between. But the other is the difference between original factual reporting and the priority of balance, with analysis based on facts, with opinion down to making it up. So to start recognizing misinformation and disinformation, you need to have an understanding of these two levels and how to check your sources. To make things more confusing, when misinformation and disinformation became more prevalent on digital platforms, we had the rise of fact-checking sites that would really take claims, check sources, and let you know if something was false or true or partly true. And now you have sites that claim to be fact-checking, but actually just continue to push particular biases and claims. So here's one that I came across yesterday. And how did I decide that this was not an actual fact-checking site? So there were three main things. One was it was taking individual claims from a small selection of news sources, which, on consideration, were generally on one side of the political spectrum. Then it was all saying, well, this claim is false, without pointing to what source they were using to say that this was actually false. So it wasn't using a really verifiable trace. So it was more an opinion that it was false. The second was, it's not clear who was behind the site. So most fact-checking organizations, when you go to the About, will tell or very clearly say, we are based at this university, we are based in this media agency, we have this nonprofit. And they may tell more about who is actually reviewing the claims. This one had a lot of claims about how they follow robust fact-checking standards and have a high recognized reputation. In fact, they made so many claims about it that you had to wonder why they had to be so vociferous that they were legitimate. You know, it's kind of that Hamlet thing of, methinks they doth protest too much. So all of those things raise significant flags that this is not a verified fact check. And that's the same sort of process you can go through in terms of other news stories, in fact. So, and I was going to do this highlight at the end of this one, this mediabiasfactcheck.com, however. I recommend that one as one to check your current sources or other sources. I found that extremely interesting in terms of, all Canadian US sites. And that really also goes into who owns it. So the background is very good. So checking your news sources can be fun. Well, I find it fun. But then the other pressure is the speed with which information, especially extreme, shocking information goes. And the algorithms in our social media platform and other digital platforms, which keep giving you more of what you are looking at, means that people can go down rabbit holes rather rapidly. And we always need to remember that if something's free, you're the price. So your data is helping to continue to target you with advertisements, with information, and can also be used by those wanting to influence your behavior. Now, of course, I think everybody on this call will understand why this matters. You need accurate information to make the right, or at least informed choices. You know, think about buying a car. Would you buy a car from someone you don't know, sight unseen, because they say they have a lot of experience and it's a great car? Or would you do some research from people or organizations you trust as experts to figure out what's the best car for you? You know, if you're facing a natural disaster, like the wildfires in California, you need to know where the fires are, where they are spreading, what the alerts are. If you're providing assistance, you need to know where to go. But if your social media and your news feed get filled with Trump claiming water is being withheld by the governor, or that the fires are caused by diversity policies, or by Hollywood covering up sex trafficking, it hampers the response on many levels. So where officials and media have to respond to the misinformation and try to clear up the message so people can get it right. There was also a case last year in Britain when a woman disappeared and there was so many online armchair detectives, and then people would show up on site and hamper the police investigation. It developed many conspiracy theories, and it disrupted the police investigation and was really devastating for the family. So on so many different levels, we see the impacts that wrong information, whether deliberate or not, has on the people and the systems that we have. And, you know, right now you're in an election cycle. Inevitably, there will be foreign influences that will be pushing disinformation designed to disrupt national policies and systems through fake social media accounts, digital media agencies, etc., that we have to be particularly vigilant for. So when we try to see how to deal with it, we have to understand why people fall for it. You know, so one could say it's PR on hyperdrive. Its vast quantity surrounds us. It seems realistic. It's often placed strategically to appeal to our emotions of fear or outrage or pleasure. And when past lies, corruption or discrimination or ineffectiveness are exposed or felt, there's a decline in trust in general. So just trying to explain the facts of a story, while important, is not going to solve the information disorder. So what can we do? So the first thing is, the one thing you can control is yourself. So make sure you can discern what is solid information versus what is questionable, so you can make the right decisions for yourself and others can see that you are a trusted source. So when you see something or something is shared with you to be shared with others, check it before you share. Make sure you read beyond what the headline is to really find out what the news is. You check the source to make sure that it's a trusted source, a legitimate source. If it's got a lot of excitable adjectives or exclamation points or capital letters, or it's very insistent that it's not a hoax, it's very questionable. Think also about why someone is sharing it. Are they just trying to inform, or does it feel like it's leading somewhere? They want you to do something or buy something or just disrupt something. And check it against 2 or 3 other mainline news that at least verify their sources, or a bona fide fact-checking site, not the one that I shared before. Even one that you're not entirely liking or would follow, just to find out what the actual story is. And if they don't have that story on the site, chances are it's actually really not news, because they may have tried to verify it and it's not verified. The second thing that you can do individually is financially support news and information sources you trust. And I know that sometimes we have a dilemma when we feel a news source might be good, but it doesn't always report the way we want it to report. And we could discuss more about the decisions of who to support or not more in our discussion after this presentation. Now, what you could do next is to help others one-on-one or in social media. Now here I would say that you have to recognize it takes less energy and thought to put something hateful or inaccurate online than it does to craft a thoughtful, accurate reply. So the reality is, pick your battles. Think about sowing seeds, not winning an argument. So there's a whole host of things that you could do in response, and you have to judge it by context. But I think some of the key things is simply ask for the evidence. That's an interesting statement. Where did you get that? Be non-judgmental, not hyper-partisan. Maybe use some careful humor. Oh yeah, that's an interesting photo, but you know, I did an image search and that same photo showed up in a totally another place. It means something else. Keep trying to find a point of connection, because I think the danger we're all losing in this polarized society is that we're cutting people off. And we still need to live with each other to some extent. Again, ask yourself and others, you know, why? Why do you think this is happening? Why do you think Bill Gates would put microchips everywhere? You know, what would he gain? Just keep asking questions. And challenge yourself and others not to stay in your bubble. Once in a while, check other news, just to get a perspective, to burst out of that nice reality that you've created. And then finally, on that journey is to work on building a community of trust, especially in our churches, in our communities, our groups. And these are three main things. One is to be thoughtful communicators ourselves, and especially to be careful when we're introducing a new policy or practice that might especially generate some emotion, to be prepared for developments. In other words, always think a little bit about your communication strategy and to be prepared. Because you're going to have, if it gets out and it's misleading, it generates something, you're going to have to respond very fast. But the other is to keep the community connected offline on different topics, shared interests, common problems. Keep the community together. And maybe directly tackle together how we see the media. Remind the church community of Paul's exhortation about how we should be speaking to one another, to build up community, not to tear down. So here are some resources and ways to learn together. So one is you could play a game. You could bring your family or people together to learn more about misinformation, disinformation. There are many quizzes and YouTube videos out there that are fun and engaging. Get people to look them up and suggest ones and have a discussion. So here are three. The one on internetmatters.org, it's mainly around children and the internet. And this one has 3 levels that you can choose, kind of 3 age categories. But don't be surprised if even adults are caught out. So it's a pretty good quiz. You know, there are the fact check on YouTube, spotting bogus claims, is just kind of fun way to look at how you can spot misleading information. And then WAC has a digital justice quiz through that QR code. And since this is going to be shared with you, I'm sure that you'll be able to look up these information later. WAC also has a self-directed, fun course called Just Digital. which helps people learn about our digital world, from the issues of data and cookies, misinformation, disinformation, and the issues with freedom of expression. This is in English and in French and in Spanish. We also have resources for group discussion, like this digital justice guide, which you can all read together and discuss the 6 chapters together. The Breaking Down Social Media Divides addresses hate speech. It's available from WAC Europe, but they're currently migrating their website. But just keep searching for that online. And then just keep in mind the key elements: trust, maintaining trust, foster learning, and building community. And those 3 things are, I feel, the main ways that we combat misinformation and disinformation and build a community that's really based on participation and informed participation. So I'm really looking forward to your comments, your experiences, so we learn together on how we bring the community together. And certainly if you want to contact me further, my email is ss@wacglobal.org. Thank you.